So the question, therefore, is what's driving this pessimism about China? Because if you look at Chinese behavior, the Chinese have given no indications that they're marshalling great forces out to conquer other nations or even trying to sort of replace the American role in so many parts of the world. China is still today fundamentally concerned with what's happening in China. And to the best of my knowledge, does not want to step into the shoes of the United States, either in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe or anywhere else. But nonetheless, despite that, China is perceived as a threat. The question is, why? And this is a key point I want to make. I think the fundamental reason why China is seen as a threat, either consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously, by people in America and many strategic thinkers in the West, is because China is succeeding despite the fact that it is not a democracy. China is succeeding even though it's run by the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that's the core issue from which this fundamental distrust springs. And so the question we need to ask, therefore, is there something fundamentally wrong with China not becoming a democracy? Should China become a democracy? Right? And I find that this is a thing that is very much in the subtext of people's minds, but the question is never discussed in full. So this is what I hope to do as the core part of my remarks, to try and dive down to find the deeper sources of the distrust that's there. But let me begin by emphasizing that what I'm not discussing here is whether democracy is better than Chinese Communist Party rule. It's very clear that democracy obviously is a better political system. No one's going to stand up here and argue that, oh, democracy is an inferior political system. That's not the question. The question is whether China today would be better off if it gives up its Communist Party rule and converts overnight to become a democracy, which is in some ways or another the sort of hidden wish of many people. And here, maybe here, this is where I'm invoking the spirit of George Ball. I may say that if you try to view this question objectively, rationally, it's not clear that China will be better off. In fact, in many ways, China will be far worse off. Right? And this is how I think the Chinese leaders would view this question if they were asked candidly in private. They would point to several reasons why it would be a disaster for China to switch its political system today. I'm not talking about 30 years from now, today. One, many of the countries that made a sudden transition to democracy in the last few decades have suffered a great deal. And you can have many examples. Exhibit A is Yugoslavia. That country broke down. You all know how many people were killed, how democracy led to demagogues being elected, nationalism and violence and conflict. The Chinese saw all that. Exhibit B was even more important for the Chinese. They saw what happened to Russia. Russia went overnight from Communist Party rule towards democracy. And you know, when I described to you just now how the world global condition is improving, infant mortality going down, life expectancy going up, in Russia the exact opposite happened after democracy came. Life expectancy went down, infant mortality went up, the economy imploded, and people suffered enormously. And I do know that the Chinese have studied in great detail what happened to Russia, because they said, hey, this could happen to us too. So they have seen it, and they know what could happen to China. And the second point is this. If the Chinese view their history objectively and observe what happened in the last, let's say, 40 years, since Deng Xiaoping launched his 4 modernizations exactly 40 years ago in 1978. If you look at it against the backdrop of the last 2,000-3,000 years of Chinese history, the last 40 years are clearly the best 40 years in the last 200 years, since the Opium War, definitely, of 1842. But even more amazingly, if you view objectively the human condition of the Chinese people from the top to the bottom, it's never been better in 4,000 years. So the last 40 years have delivered a human condition that the Chinese people have never, ever experienced, where virtually everybody goes to school, where everybody has a meal. And people can do an amazing number of things. I can tell you, when I went in 1980 for the first time to China, to Beijing, people couldn't choose what to wear. They all wore Maoist suits, right? They couldn't choose where to live, where to work, where to study. None of these choices were available for them. Today, the same Beijing, which used to have only bicycles and no cars, has got massive traffic jams, used to have low buildings, now only has skyscrapers, and has this amazing booming middle class that is already today the world's largest middle class. So in the last 40 years, China has produced the world's largest middle class population. And of course, they don't enjoy many of the political freedoms, clearly, that Americans enjoy. But I can tell you that 40 years ago, no Chinese young student could go and study in any Ivy League or any other American university. Today, over 300,000 do, and most of them go back. But let me give you an even more stunning statistic. In the year 1980, there were 0 Chinese tourists going overseas. 0. Only government officials travel. It was impossible for an ordinary Chinese citizen to travel. Today, 120 million Chinese, right, go overseas freely. And 120 million Chinese go back to China freely. So, I mean, to go back to the old Soviet analogy, if this was a nation of gulags, oppressive state, why would 120 million Chinese go back? Right? So clearly something fundamental has changed in the Chinese condition, even while it's been under Communist Party rule. So what the United States sees as a completely static picture of China still remaining under Chinese Communist Party rule is a China that has been completely transformed in the last 40 years. But there are even other things that are even more amazing about contemporary China. Now, as you know, the theory is very clear. If you don't have democracy, if you don't have freedom of speech, if you don't have freedom of media, people cannot think, they cannot innovate, and they cannot become masters of world industries, right? Now, I can tell you that the Chinese people don't have the right to vote, they don't have freedom of speech, they don't have freedom of media, but they're developing the most innovative economy in the world. In theory, it's not supposed to happen. In practice, it's happening. And I can tell you, for someone like me who goes to China regularly, it's mind-boggling how China keeps changing year by year. And I come from Singapore, one of the most successful states in Asia, right? We always thought we'd be ahead of China. And then I discovered, to my embarrassment, that Singapore is so far behind because we still carry cash around. No one in China carries cash. Everyone carries a smartphone. They look at me very strangely when I produce cash. What's this? Don't you know? And when I went to give some lectures at Peking University, the guy escorting me just took his phone, put it on 2 bicycles. I bicycled to my destination just with a phone. You can do anything in China with a phone, right? And if you want a hot fried egg for breakfast at your doorstep, you get it in China. That kind of quality of innovation that they're doing, it's stunning. And this is not just in consumer areas. I mean, I don't know enough about artificial intelligence. I don't know enough about supercomputers. I don't know enough about space exploration. But I do know that they've made huge advances in those areas. So what in theory is not supposed to happen is happening. But at the same time, the American perception hasn't changed. And here, let me read to you something. It's a literal quote from the National Security Strategy of the United States of 2002, George W. Bush's administration. Thank you, Andy. Andy Nathan was my source. I saw it in his class. I said, wow, I must use this slide. And this is what the statement says. We welcome the emergence of a strong, peaceful, and prosperous China. The democratic development of China is crucial to the future. Yet, a quarter century after beginning the process of shedding the worst features of the communist legacy, China's leaders have not yet made the next series of fundamental choices about the character of their state. And they add, in time, China will find that social and political freedom is the only way that China can become great. But China is becoming great. And this statement seems so strange. This is what the theory is supposed to be. But the practice is completely different. And so, going back to the perspective of a future historian, looking at American perceptions of China and insisting that China must follow the American path, the future historian will scratch his head and say, this is a civilization that's been around for 4,000 years. It has had its ups and downs. Now it's rising with great ferocity. The last 40 years been the best 40 years in China's history. And just at a moment when it's doing incredibly well, a young 250-year-old nation is telling the 4,000-year civilization, you don't know what's good for you. We know what's good for you. If you don't become democratic, if you don't have human rights, if you don't unleash all that, you will go nowhere. Again, a future historian will be very, very puzzled by this statement, just looking over the long view at what China has done. So clearly, what I'm trying to suggest to you very delicately is that it's time for America to change its language and concepts that it uses to understand China. And it is obviously what's happening in China doesn't fit Western political theory. So you have a choice. Do you want to stick to the theory or do you want to pay attention to the facts? And the facts don't fit the theory. And so we have to adjust and deal with this. Because if you don't do it, then clearly the collision course will come. Because China, I am almost 99.9% certain, will not change its political system on the advice of the United States of America. It won't. It just won't. it's going to keep on doing what it thinks is right for itself. And the question, therefore, is, can the United States accept this? Right? And here I want to add an important historical footnote, no? That actually I must confess I just read from Graham Allison's book, the Thucydides Trap book. And he says many in America wish that China could be like America as it was rising. And Graham Allison adds, be careful what you wish for. Because he says in 1897, soon after Teddy Roosevelt arrived in Washington, D.C., within 10 years of Teddy Roosevelt arriving in Washington, D.C., and Teddy Roosevelt, as you know, was so confident that the American century was on the way, so sure that history was on his side, and he marched on, and this is what he did. United States declared war on Spain, expelling it and acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. He threatened Germany and Britain with war, supported insurrection in Colombia to create Panama, declared itself policeman of Western Hemisphere, and asserted its right to intervene anywhere. United States as a rising power. So Graham Allison gives some very good advice. Please don't ask China to be like America as it is rising. Because if you're doing that, you're giving the wrong advice to China.